The book of Genesis. In the first video, we saw how chapters 1 through 11 set up the basic storyline of the Bible. God has created all things, and he makes humans in his image to rule the world on his behalf. The humans choose sin and rebellion, and so the world spins out of control into violence and death, all leading up to the rebellion and scattering of the people in Babylon. And so the big question is, what is God going to do to rescue and redeem his world? Well, out of that scattering at Babylon, the author traces a genealogy of just one family that leads eventually to a man named Abram, later known as Abraham. And God's promise to Abraham at the beginning of chapter 12 opens up a whole new movement in the story. God calls Abraham to leave his home and go to the land of Canaan, which God says will become his one day. And in that land, God promises to make Abraham into a great nation, to make his name great, and to bless him. Now, these promises are connected back to earlier parts of the book. So Babylon had arrogantly tried to make a great name for itself, and that didn't go over very well. But God, in his generosity, is going to bestow a great name on this no-name guy, Abraham. And God's blessing of Abraham echoes all the way back to that original blessing God gave humanity in the beginning. So the question is, why is God going to bless Abraham and his family? And the last line of God's promise makes this clear. So that all the families of the earth will find God's blessing in you. Now, this is key for understanding the whole rest of the biblical story. God's plan is to rescue and bless his rebellious world through Abraham's family. And this is why the whole rest of the Old Testament story is just going to focus on this one family, eventually called the people of Israel. This is also why Israel will later be called a kingdom of priests at Mount Sinai. God wants to use them to show all of the other nations what he's like. And ultimately, this is the promise that gets picked up by the later biblical prophets and poets who say that its fulfillment will come through Israel's messianic king, whose reign will bring justice and peace to all of the nations. Now, at this point of the story, none of that's clear. You just have to keep reading and watch the promise develop. And so the rest of the book focuses on Abraham and his family. First, Abraham himself, then his son Isaac, and then his son Jacob, and then Jacob's 12 sons. And the stories about each generation, they're united by two main themes. So first, each generation of Abraham's family is marked by repeated failure. They just keep making really bad decisions that mess up their lives and that put God's promise in jeopardy. However, God remains faithful to them. He keeps rescuing them from themselves and reaffirming his commitment to bless them and bless the nations through them despite their failings. So the Abraham stories. God had promised Abraham a huge family, but on two different occasions, he's afraid for his life because other men are attracted to his wife, and so he denies that he's even married to her, which creates, of course, all of these problems. And not only that, Abraham and his wife Sarah, they can't have children, and so Sarah arranges for Abraham to sleep with one of their servant girls, which also creates all of these problems in the family. But each time, God bails Abraham out. And in chapters 15 and 17, God even formalizes his promise to Abraham with an official commitment called a covenant. This is a classic scene. God invites Abraham to look up at the night stars and to count them. And he says, that's how numerous your family's going to be. And despite all of the odds, having no kids and no way to have any at the moment, Abraham looks up in the sky and simply trusts God's promise. And God responds by entering into a covenant with Abraham, promising that he will become a father of many nations, that God's blessing may come to the whole world. God asked Abraham to mark his family with a sign of the covenant, circumcision of all the male boys in the family. This is a symbol to remind them that the fruitfulness of their family is a gift from God. And so Abraham has lots of kids eventually, and he dies at a good old age. Now, the Jacob stories play out these themes even more dramatically. From birth, Jacob lives up to the meaning of his name, which is deceiver. He cheats his brother Esau out of his inheritance and blessing, and he does it by deceiving his old blind father, no less, and then he just takes off. He goes on to take 4 wives, even though he really only loves one, Rachel, and this creates all of these rivalries in the family. The only thing that humbles Jacob is being deceived by his uncle Laban, who cheats him out of years of his life. The tables have finally turned. And so it's a humbled Jacob that returns to his homeland. And in a very strange story, Jacob ends up wrestling with God as he demands that God bless him. Some things never really change, do they? However, God honors his determination, and he passes Abraham's blessing on to him. And he renames Jacob as Israel, which means wrestles with God. Now, it's this last part of the book, the story of Jacob's sons, where all the themes come to a head. Jacob loves his second to youngest son, Joseph, more than any of the others, and he gives him this special jacket. And the 10 older sons come to hate Joseph, and so they kidnap him, and they plan to kill him, but instead they decide to just sell him into slavery in Egypt, where he ends up in prison. Talk about family failure. But God is with Joseph, and he orchestrates Joseph's release from prison, and Pharaoh ends up elevating Joseph to second in command over all of Egypt. And so Joseph saves the nation of Egypt during a famine. And he also ends up saving his brothers and his family from starving to death. And so once again, we can see the folly and the sin of Abraham's family is met with God's faithfulness, who subverts even the evil of the brothers into an occasion to save life. And this is actually what Joseph says right near the end of the book. He says to his brothers, "You all planned this for evil, but God planned it for good, to save many lives." Now, these words are strategically placed at the end of the book because they summarize not only the story of Joseph and his brothers, but the book as a whole. From Genesis 3 onward, humans keep acting selfishly and doing evil, but this God is not going to leave his world to its own devices. He remains faithful and determined to bless people despite their failures. You can see this especially in how that mysterious promise about the descendant of the woman gets developed throughout the book. So remember, Genesis 3, God promised that this wounded victor would come and crush the snake and defeat evil at its source. And the author then connects this promise directly to the line of Abraham. This is a part of how God's going to bring his blessing to the nations. Now, from Abraham, this promise gets connected to Judah, the fourth son of Jacob. And this is how. In an extremely important poem in chapter 49, in aging Jacob, he's on his deathbed, he wants to bless his 12 sons. And when he comes to Judah, Jacob predicts that Judah will become the tribe of Israel's royal leaders, and that one day a king will come who will command the obedience of all the nations and fulfill God's promise to restore the garden blessing to all of the world. And then after this, Jacob dies. And later, Joseph dies too. And the growing family remains in Egypt. And so the book of Genesis ends with all of these future hopes and promises left hanging and undeveloped. And it forces you to turn the page to see how it's all going to turn out. But for now, that's the book of Genesis.
Just a quick, 5,000 year history in those two videos, something like that. Okay, so we're going to spend all of our time today in just chapter 12. This seems very loud all of a sudden. But we're going to start reading in chapter 11 because I want us to rewind and pick up right where Abraham's story picks up. And then we'll follow it into Genesis chapter 12. So if you would turn in your Bibles to Genesis 11, 26 is when Abram is first mentioned. And we're just going to read all of chapter 12 as well. It says, after Terah had lived 70 years, he became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. This is the account of Terah. Terah became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran, and Haran became the father of Lot. While his father Terah was still alive, Haran died in Ur of the Chaldeans, in the land of his birth. Abram and Nahor both married. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. She was the daughter of Haran, the father of both Milcah and Iscah. Now Sarai was barren. She had no children. Terah took his son Abram, his grandson Lot, son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, the wife of his son Abram, and together they set out from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. Terah lived 205 years, and he died in Haran. The Lord had said to Abram, "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So Abram left as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated, and the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. Abram traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Moreh at Shechem. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there, he went on toward the hills east of Bethel and pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. Then Abram set out and continued toward the Negev. Now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was severe. As he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, "I know what a beautiful woman you are. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his wife.' Then they will kill me, but will let you live. Say you are my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you." When Abram came to Egypt, the Egyptians saw that she was a very beautiful woman. And when Pharaoh's officials saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and she was taken into his palace. He treated Abram well for her sake, and Abram acquired sheep and cattle, male and female donkeys, men servants and maidservants, and camels. But the Lord inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household because of Abram's wife Sarai. So Pharaoh summoned Abram. "What have you done to me?" he said. "Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her to be my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her and go." Then Pharaoh gave orders about Abram to his men, and they sent him on his way with his wife and everything he had. So this chapter sort of leaves you feeling a bit strange at the end. The first half, you're feeling good. You're feeling positive. And then you end real confused. So we're going to discuss all of that so that hopefully you're not confused as we finish up today. So last week, we studied the genealogies in chapters 10 and 11, as well as the story of the Tower of Babel. We learned that those genealogies give us a history of 70 nations that have come out of those three sons of Noah. Those three sons have each sort of claimed a territory or a region that their families are building in, and we had Japheth in the north and Ham in the south and sort of Shem in the middle. What we realize is that after this, we don't hear about Japheth anymore, which is maybe for many of us unfortunate. We think, well, where do we play into that? But don't worry, this chapter will tell us where we play into that. We spend most of the time, really for the rest of the Old Testament, focusing on the family of Shem, with a lot of things happening from the family of Ham as well. So we find out one of the descendants of Shem, a man named Terah, had three sons. All these important men, it seems, in the beginning of Genesis have three sons. Adam has three sons, Noah has three sons, and then Terah also has three sons. And one of them just always gets forgotten, but that's okay. So we find out later, we find out Terah also has daughters, but that's a little secret that Moses saves until chapter 20. And we sort of get stopped in our tracks here when we're reading at the end of chapter 11 that one of Terah's sons, Abram, is in a bit of a predicament. His wife is not able to have children. And that, as was mentioned last week, should shock us, should stop us, cause us to pause, because we've just gotten through all of these genealogies. We've heard this person had this son, this person had this son, and then we get to this point and we go, what are we going to do? The line is stopped. There's no more children coming out of Abram. And so it should cause us to pause. The complete change here should sort of start us to wonder what's so important about Abraham that we need to know that his wife wasn't able to have children. Why didn't we just skip over him and focus on the line of Nahor? He had a son, Lot. We find out pretty quickly that this story is focused on Abram, and that the rest of the book is going to be focused on his family. We find out that Abram is living in an area called Ur. I provided a little map for you. So if you could find Ur there, to find out where Abram started. This would be in modern-day southern Iraq. And so Abram, his father Terah, his two brothers, his nieces and nephews, they're all living in Ur at the time. Now, the people of Ur were quite notable. There was a big excavation that took place in the 1920s that uncovered Ur and kind of saw what it looked like at the time of Abram. And what archaeologists found was remarkable. They were very advanced. If you can see there, that's a typical home. And I know the writing's really small, but if you look, you'll be able to see that there is an indoor bathroom, which, I mean, I barely had one of those like 4 years ago. So living in East Africa. So they were doing pretty well in Ur. It was a booming city with advancements and wealth in Ur. If you remember, the Romans don't figure out indoor plumbing till 2,000 years later. So Ur is doing pretty well. It was also a place of great idol worship. They were worshiping the moon god there, which we will get back to. Abram had a big family living in Ur. As I mentioned, he has his father Terah and two brothers. If you turn your handout over, you'll see a genealogy there, a little family tree to show what Terah, and then it fills out the rest of the family tree for the rest of Genesis. Some notable connections you'll see there is there's a lot of marriages inside of the family. So what we find out later is that Abram is married to his sister, Sarai. Nahor marries his niece. Eventually, Isaac marries his cousin. And that was just the way it was done at the time. This is not a prescriptive thing, as we know. It's just descriptive. And as Deb discussed last week, that God is just using this genetic variability that He's put inside of our bodies to create all of these nations out of a small number of people. And we'll see, even from this family tree, so many additional nations get created out of just this one family. So, what was Abram's dad like? We are given a description of Abram's dad in the beginning of Joshua 24. So I want to read that for you. Joshua 24, 2 through 3 says, Joshua is speaking to the people, and he says, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Long ago, your forefathers, including Terah, the father of Abraham and Nahor, lived beyond the river and worshipped other gods. But I took your father Abraham from the land beyond the river and led him throughout Canaan and gave him many descendants. I gave him Isaac," and then he keeps going on the line of Abraham. So Joshua is saying here that Terah was worshiping the moon god while he was living in Ur. Perhaps, we don't know if Abraham was also worshiping the moon god. I think it would be safe to assume he grew up in that family and grew up in that tradition as well. We don't know when Abram first turned from worshiping this false god to worshiping the true God. But we do know that he grew up in a family whose tradition was worshiping something totally different. We find out in Genesis 11 that Terah and his family move from Ur and they go to Haran, if you can find that on your map. It's not a huge trip, but it's almost halfway to Canaan, halfway of Abraham's trip. So this is after his one son, Haran, has died. He takes his other son, Abram, and his nephew, Lot, and they move to Haran. Why would they do this? Why would they leave a city of wealth and prosperity and move to another city? Acts 7, 2 through 4 tells us why they do this. So this is Stephen's speech. He's kind of giving the history of Israel. And he explains to us why they made this move. He says, "The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham while he was still in Mesopotamia, before he lived in Haran. 'Leave your country and your people,' God said, 'and go to the land I will show you.' So he left the land of the Chaldeans and settled in Haran. After the death of his father, God sent him to this land where you are now living." So what we find out is that God first met with Abraham while he was still living in Ur. It didn't happen while he was living in Haran. So that was the impetus. This was the catalyst for Abram and his family to move from Ur to Haran. Which means that what we see in Genesis 12, those first 3 verses, probably chronologically take place in Genesis 11:31. It takes place while he's still living in Ur. He hears these promises of God. So Abram leaves and he takes his father with him. And then they stop in Haran. We don't know why they stop. We don't know for how long they stop. What we do know is that Abram is waiting for Terah to die in Haran, and then after Terah dies, he continues on to the land of Canaan. Some of you are, I know I was upset by the math here. I was looking at this, and like, Terah's 70 years old, Abram's 75 years old when he ends up in Canaan, but Terah dies at 205. Doesn't make sense. Well, that's because all your kids aren't born the same year, and so Abram must have been one of the younger kids. So probably Haran was the oldest, and then Abram came later. So the understanding is that Terah was 70 when he started having kids. So God spoke to Abraham while he was still living in Ur, and God told him something very important. The verses we have been memorizing this month of November. So we're going to do our memory work now, and then we're going to start to break apart these verses. So if you would stand up, we are going to tack on up through, I will make your name great and you will be a blessing. So go ahead and stand and just listen as I read these verses to you, and then we will do them together. This is Genesis 12, 1 through 3. The Lord had said to Abram, leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. Do that again. The Lord had said to Abram, leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. Let's do that together. The Lord had said to Abram, leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. Let's do that one more time. The Lord had said to Abram, leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. Great, have a seat. Okay, so pull out those 3 colored markers that you have and turn to the 3rd sheet of your handout. Looks like this, has our memory work right on there for you, the verses we're going to be looking at. And I want you to take your just take your regular pen first, and I want you to underline the commands that you see that God gives to Abram. And I want you so once you have them underlined, tell me what they are. You can just shout it out. What are the commands that God gives to Abram? Leave. What's the second command? Go. Leave and go. These are the 2 commands that God gives to Abram. Now we're going to number the blessings. So pull out one of your colors, and we're going to number the blessings. What's the first blessing that you see? You can shout it out. I will make you a great nation. Number 1, I will make you a great nation. Number 2, I will bless you. Yeah, number 2, I will bless you. Number 3, I will make your name great. What's the next one? Number 4, you will be a blessing. Are there any more blessings in these verses? What's the next one? I will bless those who bless you. Number 5. Is there a 6th one? I will curse those who curse you. I've got your back, God says. Number 6. And is there any more? What's number 7? All peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Okay, so we have 7 blessings. Okay, now I want you to take a different color. And I want you to circle the personal blessings. Let's go over what we think. These are blessings reserved just for Abraham. So what is a personal blessing that you see here? I will make you a great nation. Yeah, that's specifically for Abraham. So go ahead and circle that. I will bless you. That's specifically for Abraham as well. I'll make your name great. That's a specific blessing for him. You will be a blessing. Yep, also specific to Abraham. What about the rest of those? Are those personal blessings, do you think? No, those are what we would call global blessings. So the last 3 you're going to put a box around with a different color. Those are global blessings. So these are blessings reserved for all of Abraham's descendants. So I will bless those who bless you. That is continuing to be true for Abraham's descendants. Whoever curses you, I will curse. That is continuing to be true for Abraham's descendants. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. That is continuing to be true for Abraham's descendants. Okay, so let's talk about those things that you just marked up. First is the commands. God gives Abram 2 things that he's supposed to do. He's to leave and he's to go. He's supposed to leave behind the things that are from his old life, and he's supposed to go to the life that God has planned for him. How do you think Abraham does in following these commands? How does he do with the leave? He leaves, okay, so he's supposed to leave 3 things. Does he leave his country? He does, yeah. Does he leave his people? Sort of. He leaves his friends, I guess. I don't know. Does he leave his father's household? He does not do that one very well. No, he takes his father Terah with him all the way to Haran. He takes Lot with him all the way to Canaan. Now, I would hope he would take his wife with him. I think God wanted him to take his wife with him. But these other 2 men, I don't think that God intended for him to take them with him. It would have been hard. You're absolutely right. Jesus says, I forgot to write this verse down, but Jesus talks about this same exact problem, doesn't he? When he says, follow me, and a man says, but I need to go bury my father, and he says, then you're not really committed. You're not following me then. And that's the same thing that God is saying here to Abram. He's saying, I have to be the top priority, and he takes his father with him. He can't leave his father behind. Or he chooses not to leave his father behind. Well, Jesus tells him to sell all of his belongings, and he walks away and goes, never mind. I'm not so interested. So there is, God asks us to do hard things, expecting us to fully 100% follow him, and Abram falls short here. We don't see God reprimanding Abram for this, though. We don't see God saying, Abraham, I'm going to punish you because you brought your father with you, because you couldn't leave your nephew behind. Instead, though, we do see some of the consequences of these actions. Lot causes him a lot of problems, and we'll start to see that in the next chapter, next week. Overwhelmingly, though, what we see is God commending Abram for following these commands, even though he does not do it completely. How does he do on the go command? He does pretty well. He does go. He goes in 2 stages, but he does go, and he goes all the way to Canaan. Okay, so the next thing we see are the 7 blessings that God gives to Abram. The fact that it's 7 blessings is significant. God's saying, I'm going to show you that it's a perfect or complete blessing. That number 7 always shows that something is whole and perfect. And so God is giving Abraham a complete, perfect blessing here as well. We see that the blessings, as we said, are split into 2 categories, personal blessings and global blessings. Those personal blessings in verse 2 are intended just for Abram. These are ones that are specific to him. not ones that carry over into his descendants. The global blessings are intended for his descendants. So the first of the personal blessings is that God's going to make Abram a great nation. We've just been shocked at the end of 11 to find out that Abram's wife can't have children. But God still promises, I'm going to make you a great nation. And then God promises to make his name great. This is sort of royal language that God is giving to Abram. And that also should be shocking, because this is exactly what God was trying to stop in chapter 11. In chapter 11, the people of the Tower of Babel were building that great tower because they wanted to make a name for themselves. And Abram, who's not trying to make a name for himself, as he's obediently following God, God says, and so I am going to give you a great name. I am going to choose to do that for you. You're not choosing it for yourself. Abram achieves these things not by anything he does, just simply as a gift from God. The global blessings in verse 3, we continue to see play out through the Old Testament and even into modern times. Melchizedek, in a few chapters, is blessed because he blesses Abraham. On the other hand, Hagar is cut off from the family because she despises Sarah. The Canaanites are ultimately eliminated from the earth because they are going against God's people. And some may even say that the way that World War II ended could have to do with the fact that they were trying to destroy God's people. And so they couldn't have won. They were going to be cursed because they were cursing God's people. So these are the global blessings and a curse that God is going to continue to honor throughout Israel's history. The final blessing in verse 3 is the one that gets me the most excited. It's that end part of verse 3 that says, all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Paul talks about this blessing in Galatians 3. He says, I'll start in verse 6, even though this is not till chapter 15. But it says, consider Abraham. He believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Understand then that those who believe are children of Abraham. The scripture foresaw that God would justify the Gentiles by faith and announced the gospel in advance to Abraham. All nations will be blessed through you. So those who have faith are blessed along with Abraham, the man of faith. This, Paul says, is the gospel. Genesis 12:3 is the gospel announced in advance to Abraham. It's the same good news that we saw in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, but we've been given more information now. We get a little bit more clearer insight into what this is going to look like. Someone in Abram's line is going to bless all the other peoples or all the other people groups of the world. In other words, these blessings are not going to be reserved, these global blessings are not going to be reserved just for Abram's biological line. It's going to extend into his spiritual family as well, which is what we see in Galatians 3, that now Gentiles too are becoming Abraham's descendants. So what is it going to mean? It means that a rescuer is going to come who is going to reconcile the relationship between God and man. And it's going to come through Abraham's line. That relationship, you remember, is broken because of what happened in Genesis 3 with Adam and Eve in the garden. We've seen throughout our study of Genesis so far that relationship remains broken. Noah is saved. God saves him, and his life finishes with a failure as well, because people are sinners and they can't save themselves. We are living, though, in a time when this has already become a reality. It's not something we have to look forward to. It's something we can look back on and rejoice. Colossians 1 and 2 talk about this. It says there's a mystery that's been kept hidden for ages and generations, but is now disclosed to the saints, meaning the people who believe God. That mystery, Paul says, is Christ in you, the hope of glory. Later, Paul writes that he's writing to them so that they would know the mystery, namely Christ, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. So this is the gospel that God was announcing in advance to Abraham. We can really praise God for this because we get to look back and see it clearly. God was never without a plan. He didn't Adam and Eve didn't sin and then all right, I got to come up with something here. He didn't save Noah and think that the world was going to be solved. He knew that this problem was going to persist. This problem of sin was ongoing. And so he always had a plan. And now he's taking the next step to show people what his plan are. I'm telling you, it's going to come through Abraham's line. I'm going to take a little sidebar here. This message is still 100% relevant to us today. God is still working out the promise of Genesis 12:3. All peoples on earth are still being blessed through Abraham's descendants. He's not completed the work yet. How do we know it's not complete? Matthew 24:14 talks about how all peoples on earth need to hear the gospel and then the end will come. And we're still here. So I'm assuming that means all peoples have not heard it yet. And we know that that's true based off of what we know about how the gospel has gone out to different people groups. That is a job for us, for the church. When you hear me say that, I don't want you to hear me say this is a job for the universal church and not a job for you specifically. This is a job for you specifically and also for the universal church. You also are given the job of announcing the gospel in advance. I had a friend this weekend. He was like, I have questions for you about the Bible. I was like, great, bring it on. He goes, well, you can't say, well, that's just, God works in mysterious ways. You cannot give me that answer. He's like, maybe once, but you cannot do it more than once. And I said, I'm not going to give you that answer. This mystery has been disclosed to us. It was not disclosed to Abraham. He didn't know. When he was told this promise, he didn't know how it was going to play out. But we do know how it played out. We know that it is played out as Jesus. So, I'm going to finish this section. You know me, I will talk about evangelism all day long, so I'm going to move on. But what we see, though, is, I forgot to tell you. I didn't tell you to map out a cause and effect relationship from these verses, did it? Okay, well, is there one? Is there a connection between verse 1 and verses 2 and 3? Is there a cause and effect there? Is there an if-then statement? If you do these things, I will bless you. Does anyone see that? No. These blessings are independent of Abraham's obedience. There are no conditions that God gives for these blessings. He didn't say, leave, go, and then I'll start showing you blessings. He just said, this is what I'm going to do, but also I want you to leave and go. But it's not contingent on Abraham's obedience. And it's a good thing, too, because once we get to the end of chapter 12, we would have realized Abraham would have already lost all these blessings. Okay, so verses 4 and 5. So Abraham leaves, and we see what he takes with him. He was 75 years old. He's making a major life change, and he can't let go of a few things, namely his nephew Lot. But he does go. He goes exactly where God is leading him. And apparently, he's telling people about it along the way. I don't know about you, but I get very uncomfortable when I read something like, and the people that he had acquired in Haran. Was he taking slaves with him? That's what makes me think. But apparently that verse actually should be translated, all the souls that they had won in Haran. Meaning, Abram has been told these promises back in Ur. And people are like, hey, where are you going? Where are you coming from? Why are you traveling? And he tells them, because God, the true God, told me these blessings. And people start to go, hey, I want to be a part of that. And they start traveling with Abraham. And that's how he ends up with all these people. So these people he's already seeing repentance take place. People from other nations. Verse 3 is already starting to come true. People from other nations are turning from idol worship and turning instead to worship God. He's still on his journey, still making his way to Canaan, and he's already telling people who God is. He didn't arrive and wait to do that. If you are a believer and you're here, you don't have to arrive at the end to start telling the story. You already know enough to start telling the gospel. You already have the answer. You might not know all the answers. I found that out from my friends' questions. But you are not off the hook either. You have to continue to learn. You have to continue to study. You have to continue to grow in intimacy with God. As we continue to walk in obedience, though, we're asked to start sharing the gospel now. We're told to start sharing the gospel now, just as Abram did. You don't have to be perfected in your faith to start doing, because that's not going to happen. It certainly didn't happen for Abram. But he was already equipped to share enough because he was just saying the truth of what he already knew about God. And I know all of us, if you are a believer, you already know the truth about who God is. And you can start to share that with those around you. If you don't know an answer, that's okay. Just say that. I don't know, but I'm going to find out. And then continue that conversation with your friend or your family member. That's your role as a descendant of Abram, to continue to be involved in blessing all peoples on earth because of what Jesus accomplished. Okay, I promise I won't talk about evangelism anymore. Okay, so verse 6 through 9, Abram we see taking a survey of the promised land. He walks around the promised land. He walks from north to south, and he stops at 3 key points. The first is Shechem. If you find that on your map, you see there, when he arrives, Shechem's sort of over here, and then he's making his way south through the promised land. Okay, so what's in Shechem? It's the geographical center of the promised land. So he gets to the center point, and there's a tree there that was the tree of Morah, which was used as a place for idol worship. So what we see is Abram leaves Ur, which is rampant with idol worship, and he goes to this promised land, this place that God said, this is where I want to make, I'm going to give you this land. And he gets there, and he finds out that there's a ton of people already there, and they too are worshiping idols. So what does Abram do? We see that he builds an altar, and he worships God in a place reserved for worshiping idols. Then he goes on to Bethel. Bethel was a Canaanite sanctuary to the god El, which is just the word God, which was the head of their pantheon of gods. And so what does Abram do? He builds an altar, and he worships the true God there. Then Abram heads south. That's literally what Negev means. Just means the southern part. So he goes to the southernmost part of the promised land, and still more people there. There's Canaanites everywhere, but that doesn't stop him. What he's doing here is he's taking a survey of the land. He's symbolically taking possession of the land, even though he hasn't actually done it yet. He's surveying to see, what is this place that God has promised to me and to my descendants? Descendants I don't even have, he's thinking to himself. He's looking forward to the fulfillment and going, wow, this is what God's going to do. And he's worshiping God in every place that he ends up. In a sense, he's claiming that land for God. It's not like a name it and claim it thing. He knows this is a promise that God has given him. And so he's claiming those places by setting up altars in key areas where God is not being worshipped. And he believes eventually this is where God is going to be worshipped. We also see here that God appears to Abram in verse 7. God has not appeared to anyone since he was looking for Adam and Eve after they sinned in the Garden of Eden. We see that he speaks to people, but it never says that he appears to people until here. So this should also cause us to pause and look at what Abram's doing, because this is a difference from what's been going on. And what we see is that it's like God is showing Abram, I am going to fulfill, I'm going to show up and I am going to fulfill my promise to you. I am going to give you this land. I am going to make you a great nation here. I am going to make your name great. And so he shows up to personally tell Abram that. In what form, we don't know. I apologize, I'm hopping around the Bible a lot today. I'm sorry about that. But if you head over to Hebrews 11, where we can get kind of a summary of Abram's life, Abraham as he's called here. I I want to start in verse 8. It says, "By faith Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith he made his home in the promised land, like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. By faith Abraham, even though he was past age and Sarah herself was barren, was enabled to become a father, because he considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so, from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sand on the seashore. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, and they admitted that they were aliens and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them." So obviously this covers more than what happens in just chapter 12, but a lot of what happens in chapter 12. The first thing that we observe here is that it's quite different from what we find in Genesis 11. Abraham builds in Genesis 12, but not in the same way that the people were building in Genesis 11. They were building a tower to themselves. In Genesis 12, Abram doesn't build anything. He builds only altars for God, not anything for himself. We read in Hebrews 11 that he ends up living in a tent for his whole life. His son Isaac, his son Jacob, they also live in tents their whole life. He had left a beautiful home in Ur with indoor plumbing, and he lives in a tent for the rest of his life, never building anything for himself, but only altars for God. When Abram died, the things that were left were altars that he had built and the descendants God has given him. It's amazing to think about that. That's what our lives should be. They should be monuments to what God has accomplished. Monuments of like the altars that he set up of us worshiping God, but also descendants. Not just physical descendants, but also spiritual descendants, of which Abraham has the most. Do people consider us to be their spiritual parents? Do you have spiritual children? Because we obeyed the Bible, because we obeyed God and spoke the gospel like Abram did. What are we going to leave as an altar to God? You take out your note card. Don't really have time, but we'll try. I want you to start thinking about what are some of the things, some of the altars that you could leave, that you are in the process of leaving for God. What are things in your life that you can worship God for? God. And these aren't things that you've accomplished. These are things that God has accomplished that you've been able to be witness to, that you've been able to worship God for. I hope that many of you were able to be there 2 weekends ago. We had our testimony night. We got to hear of God's faithfulness, women telling their stories of God's faithfulness. We should all be able to do that. That's offering an altar of worship to God, saying, here is what God has accomplished, not what I have accomplished, not to build a name for myself. What is something God has accomplished that I can worship him in front of other people, that they would be able to see what God has accomplished? So what I'd like to do is just on your note card, think that through. How has God been faithful to me? How have I seen his faithfulness? What is something that I can worship him for and testify to that he has accomplished? And take that note card, put it in a place of prominence, share it with somebody else. Hey, this is what God has accomplished, so that other people can see it. When Abram built this altar at Morah, there was already altars there, altars to another false god. And instead, Abraham sets up an altar there to worship God in full view of other people. So what are you going to testify to that other people can hear about? Just give you another minute to think that through. Does anyone have one they want to share just briefly? I'm sorry, Roxy, I have to give this to you. Hold it nice and close. Mm. Very good. So I'm not sure if you're able to hear that, but a woman, a family that Dave and Roxy knew, came to faith right as they were leaving. And right as they left permanently, were leaving Venezuela. And the husband just passed away. And how the work continued for however many years it's been since Dave and Roxy left, that God has continued to be at work in that family's life, even long after their work in Venezuela ended. So God's faithfulness to his people, not because of things that we have done, but because of things that he has accomplished. That was a good one. Okay, so the other thing I want to look at here, and that we get pointed out in Hebrews 11, is that all of these things Abram did were accomplished, were things he did by faith. He did not receive the things that were promised. He only saw them and welcomed them from a distance. So here he is walking the length of the promised land. He sees other people living there, people not worshiping God, and he believes, he lives by faith that God is going to give that land to his descendants. And it says he's looking forward to a city with foundations whose architect and builder is God. He's not saying, oh, here I am going to build my great nation. Here I am going to make a great name for myself, and everyone will remember me and all the things I accomplished. He's saying, no, I cannot wait to see what God does here. What is he going to build here? The city that is going to be established here is going to be one whose architect and builder is God, not me. And it says he was still living by faith when he died. He did not receive the things promised. And therefore, God is not ashamed to be called his God. And he has actually now prepared a city for them. So these promises that Abraham was looking forward to, while he didn't see them here, they did get fulfilled. They get fulfilled in the generations that followed. And certainly they get fulfilled in the new heaven and the new earth. Ken Hughes gives 5 descriptions of true faith that we see displayed by Abram. The first is that he believes the bare word of God, meaning that we don't have a record of Abram asking for more information. We don't have a record of Abram asking for a sign or a miracle to confirm that he's heard God correctly. Instead, he takes God at his word and does what God called him to do. And he believes that the promises that God gives him are going to be fulfilled. The second thing is that he steps out on God's word. He obeys. He remembers that true faith has to be active, has to be obedient. If you have faith in the chair you're sitting in, then you'll sit in it. If you don't really have faith, you're just going to stand by the side and look at it. I have faith. Well, then sit in the chair. I don't think so. You don't really have faith in that chair. If you really believe in the promises of God, then you will act on them. The third is that true faith follows wherever God's word directs. Abraham had no idea where God was going to lead him. He just obeyed. We don't know when God told him where the end location was going to be. Was it at the beginning he told him? Or was it day by day? Yep, keep going. Yep, keep going. Stop, you made it. We don't know. We don't know when he got all of the information. We just know that he obeyed. The fourth is that true faith builds altars and worships wherever it goes. So true faith knows that it is about God and that God deserves all the glory for what is being accomplished. Abram never tried to take credit. He only gave credit to God for God's promises. He knew they weren't about him. And then also, true faith proclaims the name of the Lord. Abram built those altars in places where other worship was already taking place. He proclaimed the name of the Lord where it was not safe to do so. And he did it in places that it was unpopular to do so. Wherever he went, God's name was proclaimed. So it would be great if we would end our lesson right here. Perfect. Great. Verse 9. Abraham's worshiping God in the promised land. Unfortunately, we have to finish the chapter, and we have to move on to verse 10. We see none of the promises fulfilled so far. And so what happens? God allows or sends, we don't know, a famine in this promised land that he's going to give to Abram. It seems unfair. Abram has been completely obedient. He has not received anything, and now he has no food to eat. Still has no children. There's people around worshiping a different God than the true God. And so he does what people at the time did during times of famine, and is that they went to Egypt. Egypt had food. Because of the Nile, there was always things growing there because the Nile was providing the water needed. So Abram goes to Egypt to find food. But as he's traveling there, he realizes that he's going to have a bit of an issue, and that issue's name is Sarai. I'm sure every husband thinks that his wife is attractive, but I don't think that Abram is overestimating his wife's beauty here. He is convinced she's the most beautiful woman in the world, and the way people react to her throughout Genesis seems to prove that that is true. There were scrolls discovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls that describe her beauty in more detail, describes all of her features and how incredibly beautiful she was. She was 65 years old at this point, but since she's going to live longer, people assume she probably looked like she was in her 30s or 40s, and she's a knockout. This woman is gorgeous. And so Abram's not overestimating her beauty, and he's thinking to himself, this is going to be a problem when we get to Egypt. This woman's going to cause me problems. She's so beautiful that they're going to get rid of me so they can have her. So he concocts a plan. And apparently he concocts that plan with her full knowledge and her buy-in. She goes along with it. He says, Sarah, let's just say we're brother and sister. Now, we're not told till Genesis 20. They really are brother and sister. But they also are husband and wife. But he's like, we'll just forget that part. We'll focus on this other relationship. The reason he would have said that is because at the time, if your father wasn't there, a woman's brother would assume be the male authority figure in her life. So if someone did want to marry her, they would have to go through Abram to get that approval, to do the negotiation, and to work all that. So Abram's thinking, this will solve the problem. Because if anyone wants to actually approach Sarah, they're going to have to go through me, and I can stop it. He forgets something, though. He's going to a different culture. And it's not Mesopotamian culture he's used to. They do things differently in Egypt, especially when the person who catches, whose eye Sarah, or whatever, who Sarah comes upon is Pharaoh, the ultimate leader of Egypt, and he is not one who negotiates. So he just takes Sarai, not focusing on negotiating with Abram at all. And now Abram's plans have been demolished. Probably at this point, Sarah is taken to Pharaoh's palace, probably not taken to live as his wife at this point. People assume that it was similar to how, if you remember in the book of Esther, she's taken to Xerxes' palace, and there's a time of preparation before she ever meets Xerxes. And so the assumption is that Sarah was sort of in this sort of situation, that she was being prepared to be with Pharaoh, but wasn't actually his wife yet. The reason other people think this is true is because she allows this plan to go on again in chapter 20. And if Pharaoh really had taken her as his wife, I don't think she would have. People don't think she would have been willing to try it again. but she gets out relatively unscathed for this one. So what happens to Abram when Pharaoh takes Sarah? He prospers. Pharaoh gives, he doesn't negotiate with Abram, but he still pays him a bride price. All this wealth, gives them camels and donkeys and servants. Female donkeys at the time were transportation for the wealthy in Egypt. So he's giving him a form of transportation and a symbol of wealth. Camels had just been domesticated, and they weren't really using them for anything yet. They were really just like, hey, look, I have a camel. So Pharaoh's just giving him symbols of wealth. He's just making him a prominent person. At this point, Abram's plans, he's paralyzed. He doesn't know what to do. How can he get his wife back? He has no idea. So God fixes it. God fixes it by sending a plague to the members of Pharaoh's household. A plague, it says here, in my version, it says serious disease. Other people, when that word that's there is translated, people mostly think it's probably a skin problem, boils or something like that. The difference is that they look around and they realize Sarah doesn't have this problem that everyone else has. And so she starts to be questioned. And she folds under pressure. Oh, he's really my husband. I'm really married to Abram. And so that's why Pharaoh goes to Abram with full knowledge that this has taken place. And he starts yelling at Abram, why would you do this to me? And it's written in staccato in the Hebrew, take her and go. This is screamed at Abram. So what was the problem here? What was Abram's sin here? Simple. He forgot God. Hughes writes, Abram did the natural thing, and herein the problem lies. Given what then befell him, it is apparent that if he had solicited God's will, the story would have been quite different. Abram's going to Egypt was not so much an intentional sin as it was a reflexive turn to his own devices. He did not deny God. He simply forgot him. He forgot how great God is. And that is really what we are more apt to do, isn't it? We forget God. Instead of leaving altars of worship in our past, we forget that God is responsible for all that we've accomplished, for the blessings that we have, and He's already been fulfilling His promises. And we think that we should just proceed with our own wisdom. I can take care of this problem. And that's what Abram did here. He forgot God. And so Abram reaps the consequences of that. The wealth that he leaves with from Egypt does not serve him well. We'll see next week that wealth starts to cause problems in his relationship with Lot. We also see that one of those maidservants he acquires, a woman named Hagar, causes lots of problems in his relationship with Sarai. And really, we're still feeling the consequences of that problem because of Ishmael. Nations that have chosen to repeatedly reject God coming from the relationship between Abram and Hagar. I have a question for you at the end of your handout. What would this chapter have meant to Moses' first readers? How would they have reacted to these promises as they're wandering in the desert? How would they have reacted when they heard about how Abram responded to the Canaanites? They've already had one interaction, and it caused them to have to wander for 40 years. So when they read this, what do they think? What's their reaction to hearing that Abram, too, went to Egypt because of a famine? They have very similar, more recent history. What about the plagues that fall on Pharaoh's household? Think they would remember something like that? How about how those plagues led to freedom? That was God's rescue. They would have remembered something like that. So this first introduction to their first patriarch sounds very familiar to them, things that they're very familiar with. God is giving them good news. He has promises for them that are very relevant to their current situation. He's dealt with this situation before, he's saying, and I have these promises that are not contingent on you. They remain true for you. You can trust me, God's saying. I'm going to lead you to the promised land just as I led you to Abraham. just as I led Abram to the promised land, because you are his descendants. This is the land I promise for you. And we can trust God for those same things. God is still fulfilling these promises. We're able to walk in faith because God remains faithful. And he's shown us through the life of Abram what it looks like to walk faithfully in obedience. It looks like relying on his wisdom, not on our wisdom. When we rely on ours, we end up with a wife in bondage to Pharaoh or something. It looks like leaving worship in our wake instead of trying to build to ourselves. It looks like proclaiming the truths we know about him, not relying on our own wisdom to save our skin. So we can praise God because his word is relevant for the people who is happening to. It's relevant for Abram. It's relevant for the first readers, those Israelites wandering in the desert. And it was also quite relevant for us today. Any comments or questions before we finish up? All right, it has been so good to be with you this morning. I'm looking forward to seeing you again next week as we study chapters 13 and 14. I'll see you next week.